Welcome to the From Harm to Healing podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jones, and I'm a therapist who runs the From Harm to Healing treatment program, an online program for men who have engaged in infidelity or compulsive sexual behaviors within the context of an intimate relationship. I started this podcast to illuminate some of the common blind spots within the treatment fields for compulsive sexual behavior or sex addiction through the lens of the deceptive sexuality trauma model. I hope you find this resource enlightening, particularly if you're somebody navigating the pain of betrayal and deception for yourself. Thank you for listening to the From Harm to Healing podcast. As many of you will know, I recently had the opportunity to have some deeper conversations with Dr. Minwala, who developed the DST model that I've been breaking down on this podcast. And in today's episode, I also have the honor of speaking to Trish Haight, who was a critical part of that treatment center where the model was developed, and now actually co-facilitates the DST training program with Dr. Minwala. She's also maintaining her own private practice in California and runs both in-person and online intensives for betrayed partners, and I really can't recommend her more highly. She has an extensive array of professional credentials. She's a licensed marriage and family therapist, certified sex addiction therapist, an EMDR practitioner, a certified partner trauma therapist, clinical partner specialist, and of course, a deceptive sexuality and trauma or DST therapist, amongst many other things. This is the first half of the conversation we had, and you're going to hear a little bit more about her story in the episode today, so I won't add much more, but it's been personally a privilege for me to learn from her and for her to come onto the podcast and to see the ways really that she so embodies this model and so many of the ideas that I talk about in my work. I've also included a link to her website and her Instagram in the description for this episode for anybody that would like to find out more about her practice or perhaps read some of her work. And apart from that, I hope you find today's episode to be helpful.
I think I'd like to start off, though, with a breath and just, how we always do, create that extraordinary space. Even just now would be really great if we could do that. I actually do it in a 3-part ATC or approach transition condition to move from that ordinary space into extraordinary. Are you open for me to guide you through that?
Yes, I would love that.
Awesome. All right. I invite you to close your eyes and notice your breath. Notice the intention we are setting to move towards abuse victim trauma existing reality and the people that enter our office space and how we are holding trauma and the impact of deceptive sexuality trauma. And noticing your breath. Taking an inhale and exhale, settling. Inhale, readying ourselves. Exhale, riding the wave of the breath into the conditions of integrity, intentional, accurate, authentic reality, adequate safety, and humility. Taking another inhale, following your exhale into a deeper connection with you, whatever that means for you. Landing in a deeper part of you, more that embodied space. Again, whatever landing point that is, notice that. And then inhale deeply from there. And exhale, clearing this space that we're arriving in together so we can turn towards each other and invite a deep conversation.
It's amazing how something so simple as taking a breath and this idea of moving from ordinary to extraordinary. When I started the training, when Omar would first take us through that, I kind of thought of that as just a side thing. And then the more I've done this work, the more profound it's actually become to me, this simple idea of intention conditions. And so beautiful to see your version of that as well, how you incorporate that into your work.
I love taking people into the layers of it so that they can actually arrive into that self contact, whatever it means for them, instead of just the space, right? Is let me connect with myself and bring me forward also into this space. So, really honoring the landing points along the way, you know? So, I'm with you. I think the breath is such a powerful gift we have as human beings, and really to honor it and bring it into our work we do with others, but also teach others to embody that and appreciate their breath. So they're in charge of their breath, that it's not in charge of them, especially in this type of trauma.
And really, I think setting from the start with that, with the breath, with the slowing down, the, I guess, expectation, I would say, that this is more than just cognitive work. This isn't turning up for a lecture or just information. This is embodied. This is slowed down. This is trying to go top down, get to those deeper things as well.
Yeah. And arriving at the bottom of the self. Yeah. So that there's more of a whole self entering the space. Because cognitive intelligence and body intelligence, right, is one of the ways I work, is really it invites this, um, it's like a conversation, right, that needs to be had. It's a feedback loop that's going back and forth all the time. We need both of them. But a lot of times we often fall into this over-analysis space, which is that cognitive intelligence, instead of really trusting the embodied space, this deep attunement, this deep listening, this ability to tap into interoceptive awareness, which is more that somatic sensorial awareness inside of who we are, is actually the truth about healing. Healing comes from the bottom up more than the top down, you know? We have this inherent wisdom in us that we often forget, that it's not just the mind, the cognitive realm, it's the embodied space inside that allows us to shift and change. And that's actually where we metabolize. We don't metabolize in our cognitive realm, like thinking of the stages with deceptive sexuality trauma treatment, the 5 stages. We meet people in that cognitive intelligence space, they are in the throes of survival. All systems are. And I know you know this. I know I'm speaking to somebody who really truly gets it. So I appreciate that. And I feel honored to be speaking with you actually about this. But we catch them in that fragmentation because they've hit these critical injuries. And from this model of treatment, right, we have 4 critical injuries that are being hit. We have the reality ego fragmentation, when the 2 worlds collide. So there's a flailing and fragmentation in all the systems. We have that gut brain injury that is related to the enteric system, the erosion of that knowing self, which is all about embodied intelligence. So there's split off from embodied intelligence. And then we have acute relational rupture, attachment injury, which is that severing of the go-to person, the person you trusted the most besides yourself, and to realize there's no trust to be had. Again, there is this space of liminal space that is happening for people. There's no landing point. And so we catch them where they have landed, which is in this cognitive intelligence, racing to figure out and connect dots. And the image I usually use with people is, it's like they're taking their cognitive realm or their neocortex and they're racing it along, and they're dragging their whole embodied self behind them, creating more suffering, more pain. And that's not the way to heal this type of trauma. It really is to slow everything down and land as best you can into the impact versus the content. And the content is so big, it hijacks us so fast, because again, we want to make sense what's happening in this existing reality.
Yeah. There's just in the injuries you've mentioned there, you have So the injury with regards to the connection to the self. You have the injury with regards to the go-to person outside of myself that I trusted the most. So we're talking about complete rupture of connection, of healthy connection, of safety, of attachment, of all of these things that we don't just desire, but we actually need to function, to be safe, to thrive in life.
Exactly. And, you know, if you and I just pause for a moment and really kind of hold that at the deepest part of who we are as professionals, holding people who are flailing and screaming in anguish, you know, whether it's an internal scream or an external scream, we're holding them as they walk into the room. We need to really have this capacity to sit with them in that space. And that sitting with really syncs up to this model of treatment. It's the intentional vibe trauma treatment. It's an intentional vibe theory where we sit as the empathic witness to somebody else's life. And it takes the whole of us to do that. If we are only living in our cognitive intelligence, we aren't creating the sacred space for them to truly feel held. You know, if we are bringing our whole self, we are tuned in on all different levels of us. We are honoring them. We're holding them with dignity. And if we continue to hold that space, that place of embodiment and cognitive together with consistency, it promotes the cortisol levels in them to go down, which is truly what they need. We don't want their cortisol levels. They can't consolidate the information if they are cortisol heavy, you know, the cortisol showers happening. We need to slow them down. So if we hold that sacred space and we slow everything down, it creates more of that, as Martin Buber would say, that I-thou relationship, you know, where we treat another person as a whole human being, so that they can arrive in their true essence of being. And we know with this type of trauma, they're scattered away from that part of themselves, you know?
And it's wonderful to hear you introducing these ideas, these simple but profound sitting with, something as simple as just sitting with another person, but really on that energetic level. And even as you're saying these things, I'm sure for many people listening to this, they're already seeing, hearing, sensing the overlap with my previous conversations with Dr. Minwala, where we've spoken about a lot of these ideas. And so what would be great to do, because I think we could just run straight from here, but it would be good to just slow down, pull back, and maybe just think about your story with this model, because I've had the privilege of training in this DSTT or DST model, and you were one of the people training me on that program. It was Dr. Minwala and yourself. And so I've had the privilege of getting to know you in that professional capacity, but you have really been a very significant part of that clinical incubator where this model developed. So I would love to just go back to that starting point and hear a little bit about your story, your journey with this model.
Oh, thank you. I love that. You know, I just have to say, just want to take a note with you is just watching you move through the model and the evolution of you has been profound to witness. And I want you to know that, because you really honor the work and it really sings to your soul of who you are as a professional. And I think that's a powerful thing when you see one of my favorite quotes, I'm just going to say it this way, is Rollo May. And it says, and I'm going to paraphrase it, I'm not going to be perfect at it, but he says, humans reach out to one another. And when one reaches out with a passion and it's answered in an answering passion, it changes the relationship forever. It's like, that's when we sync up in this model and we are in the same river with each other. We're in the same resonance with each other. It's powerful. It constantly moves. This evolution of this model constantly moves, you know, and as we continue to train people and we meet with colleagues, et cetera, we are continuing to shape the model because we're in an intersubjective field that is deep listening. So I will circle us all the way back to when I was a little girl. How's that? I'll start with my journey from there. It's just a quick story. When I was really little, I remember my parents taking us out to dinner in restaurants, and we'd all like huddle into this little booth, you know? But I was always like mesmerized by the complexity of people. I didn't know that language yet, but I was always drawn into looking at people, the layers of them, the complexity of them. And then I was always interested in how they interacted, that energetic space in between. I was always pulled into it. And I meant for probably quite a few minutes before my parents would say, Trisha, get back to the table. Over and over again. They would call me back to the table to just kind of be there with them instead of constantly being pulled into what is that about? You know, it was almost like the world of humanity was like my laboratory of understanding what it is to be human, you know, at a very deep level as a very little girl trying to understand that, you know, again, it was exciting to me. But, you know, then life goes on and life keeps moving. And then my journey with sexual health and sexual well being, I didn't even know it was related to the triadic core because the triadic core from this model is your relationship to the physical body and to your sexuality and to your gender, who you are. For me, womanhood, personhood, sisterhood, you know, those names. For you, personhood, manhood. So when I was in another career, I had more time to volunteer and I landed in a nonprofit place where it was really in support of women who worked the streets and were selling their bodies and just to survive. And at times they were found and guided to this place where we could help them land and feel safe enough. So again, holding ISH there without even knowing I was doing that, I was holding truth or integrity, adequate safety and humility to hold these women as a safe landing point where they could rest this survivor state, you know, enough to unfold what was truly happening for them. They were so disconnected from themselves or so fragmented off from themselves that helping them guide just from a person sitting with them, not really trained yet in this profession. I was sitting with them, just with who I am, helping them reunify with their bodies and at times reunify with families. And again, it's not always perfect because, you know, there were highs and lows here for them. The old story pulling them back in, the new story pulling them towards a different kind of living. Again, the back and forth are very important. So that was one of my first landing points of really understanding, wow, this sings to my soul. This is something that resonates with me. And then, you know, just like life, something big happens for all of us and we're kind of nudged or forced or pushed to pivot. And something happened for me that was so. And I had this wake up and said, what am I doing, you know, in this career and volunteering? I love humans. I love who they are, the complexity of who they are. I know how to tune in. I'm going to go back to grad school. So I went back to grad school and started my journey there, went through that. And then I ended grad school and I was just about done with, I think I gathered 4,000 hours before I was even going to test. But in my last few months of, and that's clinical hours, right? I remember right before that, a colleague of mine, a friend of mine said, I really want to introduce you to Omar Minwala. I think you two would really connect. You guys would connect. And I was like, really? And she's like, yeah. And I was like, okay. And I only had maybe 3 months before I was going to test and license. And I met Omar and we just sank in together. And it was just like this boom, yes, yes kind of moment. You know, it was a sitting with, it was a genuine conversation. And it was like an unfolding of us with each other. And it was like the conversation just flowed. We got each other from that very beginning. And then it was a yes, yes moment again, where I decided that's who I wanted to be my supervisor for those last months. And then, you know, just as things unfold, he became my mentor, colleague, We worked together since 2009, actually. That was when I landed with him. So I've been doing it a good 16 years with him and in this model. And what's so beautiful, Chris, is just the iterations of this model, of evolving with the model, breathing life into the model. I just feel so part of it, and I am helping shape it in that intersubjective field with Omar. Such a deeply honoring professional life I have had. And not just within this model, but also in other ways that I've certified. So, and it all syncs up. I'm very much a trauma specialist, and this model really calls to those of us who are highly trauma informed and trauma specialists to help hold the enormity of what is happening. I know that might be a long-winded journey, but I think I don't know. I'm kind of proud of my journey and the decision points I've made along the way. And I'm always green and I'm always learning, and I love my capacity to do that. I'm constantly inspired. I challenge myself to stretch and grow, just like I am right now with you in conversation.
Yes, you informed me before this that there were some nerves. You haven't done this before. And it's an interesting thing, isn't it, that we can get very comfortable in different places. You can become very comfortable holding that level of trauma you're talking about in a room, sitting with, being connected with that level of pain, and developing the ability to be comfortable in that space. And then something like this can bring up those nerves again. So as you said, always growing, always learning.
Thank you for that. Yes, this is my first guest on a podcast. So pretty courageous, I think. And also just thank you for this huge opportunity, Chris. As I've been listening to your podcast too, and just hearing your voice, it's an honor.
And I'm aware you're also following directly on from Dr. Minwala. So I haven't necessarily made it easy for you, but
Yeah.
it's a wonderful opportunity to hear from both of you who were such a huge part in developing this. And it strikes me that just hearing you talk again about the iterations of the model, we talk about the 22 rooms, we talk about compulsive entitled sexuality, we talk about integrity abuse disorder, you name those traumatic injuries. None of that existed in the form it does. The injuries were there, the things were there, but there wasn't a name for them yet. So it strikes me that this whole model grows out of sitting with, like you're talking about. It grows out of truly listening and just hearing people's experience.
Yeah. Going back to that I thou relationship, Martin Buber talks about the two primary modes of human existence. One is the I thou relationship, and one is an I it relationship. And we know that the I thou is treating that person as a human being. The I it is objectification and means to an end. And so when the people we are sitting with come into the room, they are oftentimes in an I it experience. They don't know any other way to be. So as we help guide them back into an I thou relationship with themselves, which is that self contact, we are also helping them now be more in a space of I thou with another person. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the person who harmed them. We're just saying to create that interconnectedness so there's less isolation and more connection. So group process is really important for that. When we bring groups together, we're creating an I thou with the self and with others.
And it was something I experienced in the training. So I mentioned that I was blessed to be trained by Dr. Minwala, by yourself. And having recently sat in on one of the latest trainings and seen this big, vast array of people, which was wonderful to see, I was reflecting back on the very early training courses that I got to be a part of, where I think it ended up being 6 of us, and then the 2 of you. And so I kind of got the firsthand group experience, the sitting with, and I'm glad the model's growing like it is. And then from a selfish point of view, I'm really glad I got that sort of personalized private experience that is perhaps never going to happen again in that way. So what a wonderful thing that was.
I agree. I think those intimate moments of small group can be very powerful. And, The breakout rooms in trainings are kind of like that when you break out, but it's not what you're describing of just really every moment the six were together, really processing at a very deep level in conversation of deep listening, deep sharing, depending on what part of the model we landed in. I often use the microscope as the image of when we land on a topic. For instance, sitting with, you take a molecule of sitting with, you place it on the glass slides of the microscope, you push it under the microscope, you let the light shine into it, and so much comes out of, a whole world comes out of sitting with.
So one of the wonderful things about being able to speak to you about this, as I've said, is your involvement in the development of the model in the first place, but also you work with all three plates. So I've just done an episode on the podcast where I talk about the three plates. So we have the abuser, the victim, and the injured relationship itself, really thinking of those as three entities that need their own support, their own treatment potentially. And then I talked about the 5 stages. So we're taking 3 plates through 5 stages. There's a lot of work to do here. And one of the privileges of being able to speak to you about this is you have very much worked with all 3 plates and very much worked with all 5 stages. I personally focus on working with men who have built and maintained secret sexual basements. And so I have developed quite a lot of experience around that. But there's the opportunity here to hear more from you about perhaps working with some of those other plates. And one thing I just want to bring in maybe to start us off is, again, going back to this sitting with idea. A lot of the work I do with men is on the what we call attending work. So learning to attend well to the trauma, to the traumatic impacts and the pain of the partner, the impact on the relationship. And it's such a difficult skill for many men to develop because of the defenses that come up. I like to think of it as the partner's pain is often holding a mirror up to the person of the shadow, the parts of themselves they're not proud of, the harm they've caused. And so trying to help men be able to sit with that pain, attending but not fixing, becomes a great challenge. And so I'd love to just get your thoughts again, if we take that sitting with idea now, moving it into the clinical work.
Yeah, beautiful question. Let me start with slowing the process is always very key. When they enter from stage in the model, the 5 stages of deceptive sexuality trauma treatment, we get them in stage 1. And you were talking in your last podcast about the assess, diagnosis, and treatment plan. That's really important in how, we shine the light on that person who's entering the room. And so again, like if I were giving it a percentage of how much we show up in the room, our therapeutic presence is 100%, hopefully, or 90%, right? Our voice is maybe 20% because their voice needs to take the space, not ours. And I think that in itself creates that first landing point for no matter what entity enters the room, whether it's the injured relationship we're landing in stage 1, or it's the impacted partner who's in the throes of her altered self, which is that fragmented self. She can't even recognize herself. And she's caught in that content that I mentioned earlier, unable to really drop into the impact, or whether it's the person who caused harm, the abuser, who has abused trust and choice in another person. How do we slow down their shame enough and their defenses enough to really truly land into that existing reality? How they're all different, but they're all coming in fragmenting. So we know that. So slowing down and holding that therapeutic container is the key thing that I work on in those first moments. I often say it's not about me. It's about them. Shine the light there. Hold my heart open while staying connected to myself. And so that itself, that therapeutic resonance is really important. That's what we were talking about earlier, that therapeutic presence, right? Then if I move them into stage 2 and I stick with the partner right now, the partner impacted, I'm working on that stabilization that you were mentioning in the last podcast, and I'm working on helping them drop into now this state of processing impact more than content. I'm slowing them down to regulate, to pause, to land, um, so that they can get ready to move in towards that metabolization. Metabolization cannot happen unless somebody is embodied. And so that stage 2 is for them to really learn how to name something and move through it a little bit and then come up for air. Catch their breath so they're not in a trauma dive. We want to teach them that pendulation. And I often call it like going from a trauma vortex into a healing vortex. It's like this infinity loop of processing. You're working at a very deep level. That's creating a consistent regulatory process for them to actually, again, titrate or hold the trauma impact and their existing reality. So once we get them in, we or I get them into a state of stabilization, I'm already feeling the popping of the implicit memories coming up. And so those stored memories, all the memories that got stored because they jumped up into the cognitive intelligence, they are now ready to access through an embodied intelligence. And so I help bring them into accessing that at a very deep level through somatic work, through energetic work, through a deep inquiry into the self. And so I'm moving them through that metabolization process. Metabolization is all about unearthing the trauma and lifting it out into that explicit processing, which is bringing it into consciousness so that we can tend to it, we can discharge it, we can reform it, integrate it, transform it. And so those first two are like my landing and rising, or landing and restoring. Once we move into the restoring, I'm in stage 3 now, right? Metabolization. We move into this space of 4 and 5 where they're really coming up for air. There's so much more space that's created when we unearth and metabolize something and then integrate it, that a partner impacted finally starts to find connection to self. And then you see like this beautiful organic rising in them, kind of like that moment of, oh, there I am. And they're no longer searching, how I often describe when I'm doing an intensive, I'll describe they're no longer in that state of, where am I, where am I, where am I, which is an external seeking. They're more in a, oh, there I am, which is really that place of embodied intelligence, which is, oh, there I am. And you teach that pathway into the knowing self versus the doubting self. So I know I'm adding a lot of different things that I bring here, but that metabolization is really important, because once you secure the metabolization and there I am, that organic, innate healing process and that rebound starts to happen. It just does.
So I'm really hearing that picture of the reality ego fragmentation, one of those primary injuries you talked about. Hearing that idea of the self being fragmented, I'm picturing the pieces on the floor, and then you're linking it to this body-based idea of reconnecting with that, almost like picking the pieces back up, putting them back together. Does that fit with what you're saying?
Beautiful. Yeah, exactly. What a beautiful image and painful image, right? They're picking up the pieces of themselves and they're clearing and sorting on what works for them and not. And so it does take their cognitive intelligence along with embodied intelligence to make sense of all of that. Again, Chris, what you're naming is, I'm helping them come into alignment again. They're in a state of misalignment and I'm moving them into alignment. Again, it's not easy because during this process, they might get hit again with harming behaviors such as, gaslight, the integrity abuse, right? Behaviors and tactics, gaslight, minimization, manipulation, because of the fears that are happening with the person who caused harm. They're desperate to hold on to that person maybe, or to manipulate that person from not landing in a more empowered space, because again, there are so many different layers here. I might be going too far off here. What do you think?
No, it's really helpful because what I often talk about, the language I use is of safety. So stage 2, safety, stage 3, metabolization. So this idea that you can't metabolize trauma if you don't have a level of safety. You use that phrase, adequate safety. And so what I'm hearing here is you really developing those ideas more of what that actually means. So again, I think this is representative of my specialty, if you like, is working with the men. I'm really hearing the wisdom of your work with the women. So it leaves you with that fundamental question. It's easy to talk about safety, but where does safety actually come from? And there's this push-pull of partly external, and you talked about the harm that can occur ongoing that fractures the safety again, but you're talking about this embodied sense of safety. So I'd love to just hear more about getting to that in practice. What does that journey look like? Thank you for listening to this episode of the From Harm to Healing podcast. If you'd like to find out more information about the deceptive sexuality trauma model itself, you can visit minwalamodel.com. If you're interested in the services that I offer, in particular the From Harm to Healing treatment program, please visit chrisjonestherapy.co.uk.